The eighth lesson looks at probably one of the most significant turning points in modern European history. That is the Great Depression and how that greatly impacted, or at least in every way, shape, and form, made possible the rise of the Nazis. This sort of is a step on in the course where we start to look at why the Nazis came to power, which is often tested in the 4, 6, 10-mark questions. Not only that, in the 40-mark questions in this particular essay, all sorts of reasons, but lots of stuff here. I've tried to categorize it as best as possible for revision purposes, but let's get started. What you need to know, as you're probably aware, in 1929, the American stock market crashed. Without going into too much detail, speculation on the stock market led to the value of stocks on the American stock market being massively, massively, massively overrated. As a consequence, when people started to figure out just how overrated these were, the value of stocks dropped. Now, with people investing so heavily in the stock market, it meant that billions of dollars were wiped off not only the stock market itself, but out of the accounts and savings of both businesses and individuals. Not only that, because the United States was so heavily integrated, as you know, the U.S. invests in Germany in the 1920s, the world begins to feel the effects of the Depression started in the United States. Germany, because of its close ties economically to the United States, because of course the United States had propped up the Weimar Republic with huge loans, was the most severely affected country, that is, apart from the United States itself. Because those American banks had lost so much money in the stock market crash, to cover their loans, or to cover their debts rather, they turned to the loans that they had issued to the Germans, and they started demanding payback in a relatively short period of time. As the Germans were unable to cover their debts, many of the German banks and many of the German businesses that had borrowed huge amounts of money went bankrupt. Businesses, as a result of the banks going bankrupt, weren't able to borrow money to keep themselves afloat, and as a consequence, they went bankrupt themselves. Workers en masse were laid off, and unemployment, which had already been at extremely high during the Weimar Republic, somewhere around 6%, began to skyrocket. So why was Germany so badly affected? Let's dig deep. Number one, what you have to understand about the Depression was not only the fact that it was an immediate shock. It's the fact that it lasted for so very long. After the 2008 crash, you're looking at maybe 2, maybe 3/4 of a year, is when the British economy was in recession. We're talking year on year on year on year recession. The Great Depression in Germany lasts as long as 4 years. In America, it goes on for about 6 years. And the fact that also, too, it was a worldwide problem meant that countries, and no country really escaped the effects of the Great Depression. The second major issue is that Germany, of course, was heavily dependent on American loans. And, of course, add to that the fact that, and we can never forget this, it still has to pay the reparations bill, made Germany's debt problem much worse than any other country in Europe. The Weimar Constitution system of proportional representation really comes into play here because it is very problematic in a crisis. When times are hard, the political parties are less likely to work together because each plays the blame game, tries to blame each other, and they'll try and defend their specific interests. And as a result, they're less likely to work together in coalition governments. People become angry, hungry, they're broke, and they start to demand firm and radical solutions. So not only that, consensus breaks down as people during crisis tend to polarize and push to the fringes. The consequence of this, governments aren't able to establish, again, the workable coalitions on shared interests. They don't look after the benefit of the country. And as a result, they can't take firm and decisive action. The necessary steps to deal with the Great Depression can't be done by the government because the government can't work together to actually solve any of the problems. Therefore, the government is unable to do very much to help the affected millions, which, of course, compounds and leads to the consequences of the Great Depression and the fact that people get sort of so unbelievably frustrated with Weimar's inability to deal with the situation that they turn on the government itself. Now, what was life like in Depression? Okay, let's take a quick look here. Let's start with businesses. Businesses closed. Their incomes fell because there was no money to spend on the things that they provided. The government also had to raise taxes on businesses to pay for the loans that were needed to to pay for the welfare benefits needed to be received by the poor. As a result, businesses were double hit, not only by a rise in taxes, but a fall in actual profits, and things turned bad. for big businesses, as they had many closed, they had to lay off. Now, workers, on the other hand, you see that in Germany, 40% of factory workers find themselves laid off. The government will cut benefits to these workers because they don't have the money to give them the benefits that they would normally do when the government is relatively stable and people find themselves unemployed. Those that kept their jobs, okay, had to, in most cases, and the number 40% is quite deceiving, because the people who kept their jobs had to do so on the condition of reduced pay and reduced hours. So even those who were working, they were effectively a working poor. The farmers, they had never really done well through the 1920s, but of course during the 1930s things get actually worse. They slip further into debt as they're unable to sell all of their food at reasonable prices, no less, to cover the cost of running their farms. And as a result, the farmers begin to suffer even more than they did during the 1920s. Particularly acute were the problems faced by young people. Okay, over half of the Germans between the ages of 16 and 30 were unemployed. Okay, as is the case with most things, it's the older people who have been there longer in these companies who tend to hold on to their jobs. It's the young people coming out of school who find it impossible to get work, because if you're an employer, you're going to hire the person with experience who knows how to do the job rather than the kid who you have to train up. It's just easier. As a result, youth unemployment is a massive issue during the Great Depression. So you have a lot of young kids disillusioned with nowhere to go, and this all, of course, plays into the hands of the Nazis. Now, before we understand how the Nazis were able to capitalize this, we have to consider how the Depression acutely affected the Weimar Republic. Number one, throughout the Depression, they had a number of unhelpful and unpopular economic policies. Okay? Germans had always judged their country by the success of their economy. If the economy was failing, then their country was failing. The government during the Weimar Republic seemed to have no idea what to do and how to deal with the problems of growing poverty. The government will try to get out of the Depression, but had little success. They raised taxes, they cut wages, they reduced unemployment benefits. Neither of these, of course, although necessary to sort of share what little pot there is with the amount of people who are needy, do anything to endear people to the government itself. Okay? If you need benefits, you get less. If you have money, you lose it because you're taxed more. Any way you cut it, the government's policies were massively unpopular. And even though you can argue that the Weimar government probably had no choice, they did what they had to do, these policies don't win the support of the German people. Couple that with a switch in government. Now, Article 48 of the Constitution had given the President of the Republic the time and the ability to act almost dictatorially in the times of crisis. The governments and the policies enacted to deal with the Great Depression led to unstable coalitions. Okay. The Social Democratic Party, the SDP, the biggest party in Germany up until 1932, actually withdraw from coalition governments. The issue is that the government led by Heinrich Brüning in 1930 tries to cut unemployment benefits to save money. The SDP, who represent the workers, react against this, and they say they will take part in no government that is into cutting benefits. The government does it anyway. In fact, Heinrich Brüning goes to President Hindenburg and says, use Article 48 to help me cut benefits. Hindenburg does it, and the SDP withdraws from government. The result of this is that the remaining parties don't have a majority enough to form a coalition. As a result, the president has to step in and use Article 48 to pass any bill. Okay? Any law that needs to be passed at all now has to come through the president. In effect, democracy and the Reichstag is being sidestepped because the Reichstag is unworkable. Okay? However, couple this with the problem that President Hindenburg is 84 years old. He's a war hero. He's got massive connections with big business and the army leadership, and he's well past his ability to rule effectively. And Germany takes a very hard turn to the right, as the policies that are enacted with Article 48, as this is now the only way to pass a law, are all seemingly favored right-wing authoritarian government. Add to this a rise in extremism. Okay, as people and the Weimar government are unable to deal with the situation, okay, people start to turn to left and right-wing extremist parties that start to give people easy solutions. We are the only ones that can solve the problems. For example, Hitler would say that. And he is a right-wing extremist. Give me a dictatorship and I will give you the solution to your problems. On the other side, you have the communists. And the communists are saying, we need communist revolution. We need to follow the Soviet example. We need to get rid of all capitalism and overthrow the government. That's massively popular at the same time. Each side provided scapegoats. The communists, of course, scapegoat the capitalist system. They say capitalism has let you down. We're in the Great Depression. This is horrible. It's a fault of capitalism. The Nazis will blame the Weimar Republic, the Treaty of Versailles. They'll blame the communists, the Marxists, and they'll blame the Jews as an enemy within, who they will root out, of course, and these things prove very popular, okay? And as with extremist politics, as does extremist violence increase, political violence takes to the street during the early 1930s. Chaos grips most German cities. 500 people are killed in 7 weeks during the elections of 1932. And for most Germans, this sort of chaos gives them the sense that their country's coming apart at the seams. And in this atmosphere of chaos, depression, ineffective presidential government, you have the Nazis, okay? And in this atmosphere, Hitler's ideas have a special new resonance. Is the Weimar government indecisive? Well, Hitler would say, you need a strong leader like me. Are reparations adding to Germany's problems? Well, of course they are. I will get rid of the Treaty of Versailles. Is unemployment a problem? Evidently. Let the unemployed join the army. I'll build Germany's army up, and I'll use the army and the people for public works like road building, and I'll get you back to work. Their 25-point plan that seemed crazy to most people in the 1920s begins to appeal to people after the Great Depression hits. And as a result, the Nazis' presence in the Reichstag grows election on election during the Great Depression. They hit a watershed of 107 seats in 1930. That's topped in 1932 when they take 200 seats in the Reichstag. It's important to note that they never actually do receive an overall majority, but by 1932, those July 1932 elections, they become the largest party in the Reichstag, and therefore have some legitimacy to claim that they need to be intimately involved in government. Why did the Nazis succeed in elections? Let's dig deeper here. Okay, so it's not just that their ideas have some resonance, it's the fact that they were very, very good at campaigning. The methods they used were modern and effective. Hitler was a powerful speaker. He used multiple mediums, film, radio, and records to get his message out to the people. He ran for actually the position of president in 1932. He lost to Hindenburg, but it raised his profile because he traveled on a plane, city to city, sometimes speaking in many cities in one day. The idea that a politician would travel on a plane has never been used before in Germany, or for the most part elsewhere, and it showed Hitler as dynamic, new, and modern, a guy with modern ideas who can literally has the power and energy to take over Germany. He was able to appear as a man of the people who understood their problems. His posters and pamphlets were everywhere. They impressed people with the energy of their rallies. They had little concrete policy. In fact, Hitler would adamantly talk about how he doesn't have policy, and he doesn't have policy because the other parties had policy and look, they failed. But it also meant that he could drop things that were unpopular. So if he talked about something that people didn't get behind, he could drop it because he had written it down. And they repeated at every opportunity that they believed that the problems that the Germans were facing were due to Jews, communists, and the Weimar politicians, the Treaty of Versailles, and reparations, and that they were all responsible for Germany's problems, and that they would correct them. And this was an idea that started to stick. So Nazi campaigning is an important part why the Nazis begin to succeed in these elections. Additionally, order and discipline. I talked earlier about the chaos that starts to grip Germany, and I mean the Nazis are part of that chaos. However, the fact that they have frequent street battles between the communist gangs like the Red Front fighters and the police shows that the Nazis are able to, with their order and discipline of groups like the SA and the SS, sort of overcome the unruly gangs of workers that are gathering on street corners, huddling around soup kitchens, walking like vagrants through from the towns and cities to Germany is looking for work. By contrast, the Nazis are ordered, they're structured, they seem disciplined, and even though they are participating in the violence, not only that they're winning, they're showing that there can be order and discipline can sort of outweigh the sort of the mass rabble of communist fighters and unemployed who the Nazis would engage with in these street fights. Okay? Many people start to feel that their country needs a new militaristic sort of order, and it seems that the Nazis are, oddly enough, filling a void through their militarism. Okay? Not only that, the SA and the SS would as much protect or fight in the streets and give the sense of order and discipline as they would help the workers. They would organize soup kitchens. They would provide shelter in hostels for the unemployed. And this started to endear a lot of people who were suffering in the Great Depression to the Nazis. The historian Gordon Craig comes up with a very interesting argument, and he calls it negative cohesion. Now, positive cohesion would be supporting the Nazis because you shared their views. There's also something about the concept of negative cohesion that is true to the Nazis. Not everyone is taken with Hitler's magnetism, but even some skeptics, even people who don't like a lot of the ideas the Nazis are purporting, begin to support the Nazis. Okay? The idea that even though the Nazis, for instance, hate the Jews, and you might not be an anti-Semite, however, you hate the Weimar government because of the unemployment issue. If you hate what I hate, I will support you. So if I'm doing poorly and you hate that I'm doing poorly, I'll get behind you, even though there's a lot of things I don't really like about your regime. In other words, they're willing to accept the bad for the thing that they like. That's the concept of negative cohesion. And some people believe, and a lot of historians, in fact, Gordon Craig believes, this is the most important reason why Nazi electoral success increased during the 1930s. It's due to this fact of negative cohesion. It's like, these guys are ridiculous. However, they hate what I hate right now. So I'm going to support them because, well, that makes me feel good. There's also a disillusion with democracy. The biggest negative, really, as a consequence of the Great Depression, was the fact that most Germans give up on democracy. The Weimar government had suffered two terrible economic crises. Of course, hyperinflation, which didn't break the bonds. Of course, Weimar kind of strengthens after the hyperinflation, but it's a Great Depression that brings back the old memories. It lets people finally really come to the conclusion that the Weimar government is unable to tackle the problems of the Depression or the problems with the economy. When the Depression begins to bite, Brüning cuts government spending. He cuts welfare benefits, of course, with the benefit of Article 48, and he urges the Germans to make sacrifices. He called for new elections in 1930, which was a horrible decision that gives the Nazis the ability to exploit the discontent. The Weimar government makes terrible mistakes. Okay? The elections lead to another divided Reichstag. They create the impression that the democracy was about squabbling politicians who will do nothing to help the people in the real world. Unemployment nears 6 million, and the average income falls by 40%. When the president had to use Article 48 to make laws because the Reichstag couldn't, it seemed that democracy was irrelevant. And throughout the 1930s, not only was it unable to deal with the problems, for most Germans, it becomes an irrelevance. The Reichstag, for that matter, because the president is making only all the laws, only meets 5 times in 1932. Brüning relies on President Hindenburg and his use of Article 48 to bypass the democratic decision-making process of the Reichstag. For instance, he passes budgets, okay, that allow for the cutback of spending without the approval of the Reichstag. It's a major reason the SPD falls out of this government. As a consequence of all of this, Germans start to lose their faith in democracy. And when they lose their faith in democracy, they begin to turn en masse to anti-democratic parties like the Nazis, or on the other extreme, the communists. Our second last point is the communist threat. The communists gain support, as you know. And as a result of this, important people start to side with the Nazis. Whereas the Nazis were radical and unpalatable to the respectable edges of German society, the big business leaders and the rich, the fear of a communist takeover outweighed their fear or dislike for their Nazis. Okay, it's an element of negative cohesion here. They start to get worried about the growing strength of trade unions and the fact that there could be a communist revolution, which of course would lead to the overthrow of their business and their interests. They felt that the Nazis were in the best position to combat these threats, and they start to donate money to Nazi campaign funds. And the Nazis become very well heeled, very much more rich in the 1930s. Farmers are also alarmed by the communists because the communists are talking about seizing their land. Millions of peasants had been killed and imprisoned in the USSR under Stalin, and the German farmers started to see this and don't want that to happen to them. Because in Russia, the peasants didn't want to give over their land, so Stalin took it and imprisoned the peasants or even murdered them. As a result, the Nazis promised to fight to help the struggling German farmers. And the communist threat increases the support not only from the farming groups, okay, and the peasants who make up the majority of the German population, but also the big business who support the Nazis with huge donations to their campaign funds. Lastly, you've now got to consider that there's an element of the decadence of Weimar. Many had felt that the modern decadent Weimar culture that was open, tolerant, had really contributed to the severity of the Great Depression. The Nazis talked about restoring the old order, where people lived a simple life, a controlled life, a traditional life, and things were okay in Germany. They said that things had got out of hand in the Weimar Republic. It was decadent, depraved, and this depravity had led to the world's worst economic crisis. The Social Democratic Party makes a huge mistake in thinking the German people wouldn't fall for these vague promises and accusations. They underestimate the anger that Germans had towards the Weimar Republic, and as a result, when they step out of government, they leave the Germans with this sort of idea that the Weimar government is ridiculous, that the decadence, if you will, or the culture of the Weimar Republic wouldn't be rejected. And the Nazis play on this concept that the Weimar Republic was weak, it was decadent, it was ineffective. The Social Democratic Party that had formed the basis of most of the governments was responsible for it. And people start to turn to the Nazis because in their moment of crisis, they look for anything, and they see that the change in culture and atmosphere in Nazi Germany, or rather in Weimar Germany, perhaps had led to a blowback. It's that sense that, when you sort of move away from the traditional and get into the chaotic new way, that the chaos ensued, and only a return to the traditional good old values of Germany, of course, which the Nazis purported, would bring back the stability that Germans craved. So quite a lot there. We'll go through this lesson. Make sure you write down a list of questions that you have, as I'm sure there are some, and we'll answer them off the top of the next lesson. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in class.